On this episode of Uprising, Lyndon B. Johnson. He's one of the most famous and well-respected U.S. presidents of all time, and came of age through one of the most corrupt and probably evil times in United States history, the height of the Cold War. He did a lot of bad things, he did a lot of good things, but today we're going to only focus on one real particular thing he did, and a fascinating kind of historical paradox that he kind of has in this kind of virtuous figure who did do a lot of amazing kind of entitlement work for Americans, established so much of our almost non-existent social safety net. Like, a lot of what is there now is for him, founding Medicare and Medicaid, of course. The Great Society program, war on poverty, all that stuff was very, very critical. But also, he was an American politician during the 1950s and 60s and was incredibly, incredibly corrupt. And also, not to mention, a warmonger starting the Vietnam War. So that was a big, big, an important thing to consider about his legacy. And another thing about it is probably the most interesting thing, this kind of interesting academic paper that we're kind of basing the video off of today, and the strange paradox and interesting fact about Lyndon Johnson was how he first got elected. Because he first, like that BDE that we all know about Lyndon Baines Johnson, that confidence that he had, that was a distinctly Texas persona. He was a man of Texas, and he got to the White House eventually through way of the Texas Senate. So 6 days after this 1948 Texas senatorial runoff election, enigmatically amended returns produced with the winning candidate Lyndon Baines Johnson humorously referred to as his 87-vote landslide. So this is how he got his political start in 1948. Without his allegedly fraudulent victory over Governor Coke Stevenson, LBJ probably would not have continued his political career, because I do believe he already tried once at the Senate at this time, so he wasn't really going to do too well. And obviously, his later influence on national politics as majority leader in the Senate, as vice president, and finally as president, would have been lost. Accounts by historians of LBJ's razor-thin victory have invariably converged on the 13th precinct in the South Texas town of Alice in Jim Wells County, where 202 Mexican-American voters, some of whom were deceased or had been absent from the county on Election Day, reportedly lined up in alphabetical order at the very last minute to cast their ballots overwhelmingly for Johnson. So that is the kind of way that Lyndon Baines Johnson won his decisive career continuing and career birthing 1948 Senate election. On focusing a tight spotlight on ballot box 13, scholarly accounts of Johnson's victory have kept underlying statewide trends and regional aberrations in the runoff election in the dark. Presented here is a quantitative analysis, and this is, again, a quantitative analysis coming to you today from Dale Baum and James L. Haley. So we're probably going to have to, from Political Science Quarterly, from the fall of 1994. So this is where this is from here, kind of analyzing what was going on. And this was a surprisingly common trend at the time in terms of these ballots or these votes that just since America really started off as a kind of really for a long time was not a democracy, just wasn't a democracy. Some people would still argue that it isn't a democracy today and are fighting to make it less and less of a democracy. These state legislatures and state governments had so much control over the votes that were counted and how the votes were counted, and pretty much what they could ensure, and they did this for both sides here, they pretty much could ensure how certain counties and certain parts in certain counties would vote. And that was a lot of due to disenfranchisement and just the idea that these votes could be brought up and almost sold to the highest bidder, or whoever just twisted the arms the best. So, yeah. The contested runoff election must be placed in the context of the battle royale between white supremacist Texas regulars and the pro-Harry S. Truman Texas loyalists for control of the state Democratic Party machinery. So this was kind of emblematic of a big fight happening in the Democratic Party, which was really between people who were kind of FDR-type people and people who would later be aligning with George Wallace, maybe 20 or so years down the line. A very different kind of conflict than to what is happening in the Democratic Party now. The infamous Box 13 was upheld by the State Democratic Election Committee by a close vote, reflecting the acrimonious vote split between the two factions here. So the contentiousness between the state's politics in 1948 left a legacy of distrust and suspicion that prompted some to depict the new Texas senator as a Mephistophelian wheeler and dealer, a backroom guy, a lion of the Senate. Like, that was who he was for a long time, and that was his big reputation when he was president as well, was going to these rooms to be like, oh, come on, guys, we got to get this fixed. Yeah, in the second volume of his impressive LBJ biography, Robert A. Caro inexplicably refuses to place LBJ's hairbreadth margin of victory into the larger context of the Democratic Party factionalism in Texas. Caro views LBJ's success in 1948 as simply a product of character assassination, novel use of a campaign helicopter, which was actually a big deal there. He showed up in a helicopter at the time to one of the polling places, and he was like, "What?" Everyone was like, what? That is crazy. And undisguised theft, not of some 200 votes, but thousands, many thousands, in fact. And this was a kind of pretty regular context and thing at the time. So, although Texas in 1948 was a one-party state with no clear-cut geographical divisions or battles between permanent factions, it fell short of the chaos of confused free-for-alls that plagued the electoral politics of many other southern states. In light of the outcome of the first or July primary, most contemporaries of the possible regarded the prospect of an LBJ victory in August highly unlikely. He was the underdog for sure, because you got to really consider who this guy, Coke Stevenson, was. He was an ultra-conservative West Texas rancher. He garnered 40% of the ballots cast, or 71,460 vote plurality over LBJ, who was the runner-up, received 34%. So, George E. B. Petty is a decorated World War II hero and wealthy Houston attorney, captured a sizable 20%. The remaining 7% of the ballots to be cast were split among these kind of 8 other minor candidates. So it's kind of very similar to the way California was now with this kind of jungle primary, because Texas Democrats were the law of the land there. They were kind of a one-party state, as I said before. Because Petty had waged his campaign on anti-communist and pro-states' rights flanks, pundits theorized that in the runoff, his supporters would flock to Stevenson, who, while governor, had sympathized with the anti-Franklin Delano Roosevelt Texas regulars, who were pretty much like, no economic justice, no that could possibly go to any black people. Like, that is just unacceptable. And the idea that we really have to go in any kind of economic progressivism and any kind of redistributive policies in the first place, no. We want to be racist. That was their big priority, was racism overall there. And the other guys were like, yeah, we could be racist, but we could also do some technological advancements as well for poor and working people. That's something that we could handle, but yeah, that was pretty much the extent of the factions there. Opposition in Texas in the 1940s, labor union in Texas in the 1940s to labor union activities and early civil rights movement dictated that LBJ, a consistent supporter of President Roosevelt, would have to shift to the political right if he were to have a chance at winning a statewide election. So, portraying Stevenson as a Cold War isolationist and a dupe of big northern labor unions, LBJ was a staunch pro-Truman loyalist. He compared Truman's civil rights program to a police state. He supported the Taft-Hartley Act and called for local control of offshore oil lands. LBJ never doubted his only chance of defeating Stevenson depended on winning the bulk of the conservative petty voters, and he went out to go for them, hitting that anti-communist line that he would do so effectively. 20 years later, when he was in the White House, he reflected he probably only got 70 or 80% of the votes that went to George Petty. An opinion that mirrored the conventional wisdom regarding his 1948 success. Popular belief and LBJ's own assumption about the configuration of his dramatic victory, however, are not supported by the actual evidence. The actual evidence is he stole it. LBJ's indispensable pragmatism in the 1948 campaign could not cloak his popularity among most of his party's liberal loyalist faction, a circumstance that predictably proved to be a liability among the petty voters because they were not interested in voting for a liberal. And if he wanted to win, he had to get the liberal or the petty support. Stevenson corralled the majority of petty voters, according to the probabilities of voting behavior generated by the analysis of voting returns. from the 252 Texas counties that held first and second primaries, Stevenson corralled the majority of petty voters in, again, where LBJ captured slightly over 1/5 of them. The balance of petty voters sat out the runoff balloting altogether because virtually none of Stevenson's original voters subsequently voted for LBJ, and the only other opportunities for LBJ to pick up new supporters were among the ranks of Texans who had not voted in the first primary or had cast ballots for one of the 8 minor candidates. So that's really where he only, and it kind of makes sense. Like, that's the only place he could pick anything up. So let's backtrack here a little bit. So this pretty much, this funnily enough, happened to Lyndon Johnson in the past. So this kind of scandal that in this Texas race that saved his political career kind of happened to him in the past. And all it does kind of go back to, again, this 1941 Senate primary that he lost and was stolen from him by Governor W. Lee Pappy O'Daniel. So Pappy O'Daniel stole it from him and was the kind of Senate won in the Senate primary in 1941. One day after the election, Johnson was proclaimed the unofficial winner. Campaign workers hoisted the jubilant candidate onto their shoulders, and John Connolly, the Johnson campaign's manager, sent a telegram: "Unless a miracle happens, looks like we're in." But an overconfident Johnson made a crucial mistake. He had instructed his key districts to report back their results promptly on primary day, but alerted O'Daniel's men, so Pappy O'Daniel's men, to precisely really how many votes they needed to discover in unreported districts to guarantee a win. So that's kind of how it worked at that time. So, so it's all this original scandal kind of centers around this box 13 that was stuffed with votes for Johnson, and it remains at large. And it was really kind of a broader representation of the culture of that time. So what we would see was a candidate on both sides of the aisle. We'd have the Senate primary, Democratic primary, 2 opposing candidates. Each of them would kind of go to the county officials, which again had a lot of control over the elections, and know and kind of begin to suss out how many votes they needed to discover at the last minute to push themselves across the line in whatever election they needed. But the thing was there, Johnson just cheated wrong, and Pappy O'Daniel cheated better, and that would not be the case this time. Johnson did not contest the 1941 election results, but it was the only electoral defeat that Johnson ever suffered. This was, of course, 3 days after the election. O'Daniel was declared the winner by 1,311 votes, and that was the votes that kind of O'Daniel pulled out of a hat that back in 1941. So, he called it the most miserable period of his life. He was in his feelings there. He didn't want to invite any scrutiny with the 1941 election results, which, again, makes sense. But his campaign had engaged in questionable voting practices with the help of people like George Parr, political boss known as the Duke of Duval County. He ruled much of South Texas through patronage and forced regularly fixing these elections, again, according to Texas Monthly article from the 1990s. He proved invaluable in 1948 when Johnson decided to run for Senate again, here this time against Coke Stevenson. 3 days after the election, Stevenson was the unofficial winner, but pretty much how it played out here, and we'll get into more of the details when we circle back. But votes continued to trickle in from far-flung precincts 3 days after the 3 days after the election when Stevenson was in the lead. So 3 days after that, officials made a startling discovery in this place called Alice, Texas. So Precinct 13's tally sheet, which had reported 765 votes for Johnson on primary day, had now listed 965 votes in his favor. One of Parr's men, it was later revealed, had extended the lip of the 7 downward into a 9. Very, very interesting and convenient there. The votes for Johnson were written in the same handwriting, signed in the same ink, and cast in alphabetical order. So it literally not even really trying very hard. So nevertheless, Johnson was pronounced a victor, earning the tongue-in-cheek sobriquet landslide Lyndon for winning by less than 0.01% of the total vote. Ever since, Alice residents have heard their fair share of stories, that's for sure, because you just cast votes, you literally write people's names off the voter rolls Check, Lyndon Johnson. Check, Lyndon Johnson. Check. Like that's pretty tiring. Obviously, that your hands probably going to be cramping, and people are going to start to know what's going on. 80-year-old Homer Dean. This again, he's 80 back in the 1990s here.